to speak to you on this subject, a man's hand. And this is a message from God about your hands, the shape and the size of your hands, and how you can learn the purpose of God for your lives. This is the story. There was almost total backsliding in the nation of Israel. The worship of God had been supplanted by the worship of Baal, an idol god. In the meantime, God stirred the spirit of Elijah, that shaggy son of the hills. And he came out of the mountain like a whirlwind and said to the king, "It shall not rain for 42 months except at my word." And the judgment of God was pronounced because of the backsliding and idolatry of the people. And for 3.5 years, not a drop of rain fell upon the earth. Elijah came to King Ahab. He said, "King, I challenge you to a duel in the sun. You gather the people of Israel to me, to Mount Carmel." So the day was appointed, and he stood beside Ahab as the people spread out like grasshoppers for number down the hillside and in the valley. On one side were all the false prophets of Baal. So Elijah said to the false prophets, "You build an altar and put no fire under and call upon your God. I'll do the same. And the God who answers by fire, let him be God." All the people answered, "It was well spoken." So all day the false prophets of Baal called upon their God, but no fire fell. At evening, Elijah came to their broken down altar, rebuilt it in the name of the Lord, got down on his knees and turned his face toward heaven and called upon the Lord God of heaven and earth. And suddenly the fire came streaking out of heaven. It consumed the sacrifice. All the people fell on their faces and cried, "The Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God." And at that moment, he turned and whirled away, went on the very top of Mount Carmel, sat down, put his head between his knees, and said to his servant, "Go look toward the sea, and come and tell me what you see." And pretty soon, the servant returned and said, "Prophet of God, I do see something, but it's very small." "What do you see?" "I see a little cloud rising out of the sea like a man's hand." Now, this is the most peculiar cloud that ever arose from the sea. Now, in the Bible, the sea represents the human race. And here is a cloud shaped like a man's hand. It was a cloud that had a thumb, 4 fingers, a palm, and a heel. It was shaped exactly like a man's hand. Now, when Elijah looked up and saw the cloud shaped like a man's hand, knowing what the sea represented and meant, he realized that this cloud meant him, meant his hands, and that God was going to bring revival to his people through his own hand. Listen to me, friends. Everybody in this tent, look at your hands right now. I want you to look at your hands. Sitting right there in your room, look at your hands. Look at them. Everybody in the tent, look at your hands. I have 2 things to say to you about your hands. First, the shape of your hands is the shape of God's plan. Now you can stop looking at your hand. Look at me a minute. The shape of your hand is the shape of God's plan. Now there are many kinds of hands. There are big hands, middle-sized hands, little hands. There are little boys' hands, little girls' hands. There's mother's hands. There's daddy's big, strong hands. And if God has spoken to you and told you to do something, you may rest assured that he will give you the power to successfully carry it out. Listen to me now. One time there was a little girl who was very ashamed of her mother's hands. Her mother's hands were scarred, bruised, and ugly. And every time company came, the little girl would make her mother promise to wear gloves, which her mother always did. One day the mother gave a birthday party for her daughter, and the girl made her promise not to forget and take off her gloves in front of the other little girls. But during the rush and while she was serving, she forgot and pulled off her gloves. Well, when the party was over and the little girls went home, the daughter came into her mother. She said, "Oh, Mother, you've embarrassed me to death. Why did you take off your gloves? You promised you wouldn't forget. Why did you do it, Mother?" "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do it, but I got so busy I forgot and pulled them off." "Mother, why are your hands so ugly? Other girls have mothers who have beautiful hands. Why are your hands so ugly?" Well, she said, "Honey, maybe the time has come for me to tell you. When you were a baby, I had to wash with my own hands. One day I had the tub in a chair leaned up against the side of the house, and I was washing on the rub board when all of a sudden I smelled smoke. I looked up and our house was on fire. My first thought was my baby. You were asleep in there in your crib. And I ran in and beat the flames out of my way and beat the flames from your cover, snatched you up and ran out of the house." Honey, the fire burned Mother's hands, and that's why my hands are so ugly. The girl looked up at her mother's face and said, "Mother, give me your hands." She took them and put them up to her mouth and kissed them and said, "Mother, you have the most beautiful hands in the world." People, I like to think that God uses my hands, and I take my hands and help beat out the flames around the souls of men. I like to think that God will use your hands to help beat out the flames around the souls of men around this world. I like to think that God, using my hands to be placed upon the sick and pray the prayer of faith, uses my hands to reach out to the unsaved and help draw them to Christ. Let me tell you, neighbor, the shape of your hand is the shape of God's plan. Put it in His hand and let Him use your life. Do it now. Would you bow your heads, please? Oh God, I've never been more keenly conscious of the Lord's presence and of Thy power to save men's souls. Hear me tonight, and may many hundreds of people in this great audience give their hearts to Christ. May they put their hands in God's hands, and may they be saved this night for the blood of Christ without the loss of any.